Welcome to St. John Vianney Center's podcast series, Journey to Thrive. My name is Sister Mercedes McCann. In this podcast, I will be addressing the topic of navigating role to soul, moving from active ministry to retirement, and how to do it with grace. I hope you find it helpful information for aging gracefully. So I'm going to begin with a little story. It's called The Cracked Pot, and it's a folk tale from India. Long ago, there lived a man whose job it was to haul water from the stream uphill to his master's house many times each day. To do this work, the water bearer had two large pots that hung from each of his shoulders. They hung on a pole that he carried across the back of his neck that was balancing what was on the two shoulders. The two pots were identical, but only one of them was perfect. The other one had a small crack in it. So with every trip up the hill, the cracked pot lost nearly half of its water, while the perfect pot delivered a full portion. The perfect pot was proud of its accomplishments and loved to brag about them. He also loved to point out to the cracked pot how flawed it was, that no matter how hard the water bearer worked, the cracked pot only ever managed to deliver a half portion of water to the master's house. The cracked pot felt ashamed of his imperfection and was miserable that he could accomplish only half of what he had been made to do. One day the cracked pot spoke to the water bearer when they had stopped by the stream. "I am ashamed of myself, and I must apologize to you for my flaw, for my inability to carry all the water you need me to carry. You work so hard, and I failed to give you the full value of your effort." The water bearer listened and looked upon the pot with compassion and said, "As we return to the master's house this time, I want you to pay attention to the beautiful flowers growing along the path." And indeed, as they went up the hill, the cracked pot did take notice of the sun warming the beautiful wild flowers on the side of the path and felt cheered somewhat. But at the end of the trail, the pot again felt miserable and apologized once more for having lost half its water along the way. The water bearer said to the pot, "I'm afraid you do not understand what I was trying to show you. Did you not notice that there were flowers only on your side of the path and not on the other pot's side? That's because I planted flower seeds on your side of the path, and every day while we walk back from the stream, you've watered them. I have known about your crack from some time, and could have crafted a new pot. But because of your flaw, we have been able together to grow beautiful flowers, and with them bless many tables. Without you being just the way you are, where would we have found such beauty?" I love that little story because I think as we age, we begin to see more of the cracks in our own personal pots and begin to feel badly about them and not think that we are contributing as much as we could be contributing. So I always think that's a good story to remember that the contribution is whatever a sister is able to make. So today we're going to talk about grace-filled aging. How do we age with grace? And, with every passing day, each one of us is aging. We might be at different points of that aging process right now, but with every passing day, we're aging. And often, some days, it becomes much more apparent to us than at others. But I think when we think about aging gracefully, we have to think about what is left of our lives. Are we going to sit back and let aging overcome us, or are we going to participate in that aging process? To quote Mary Oliver's poem, "Tell me, What is it you plan to do with your one wild and glorious life? It's not over until everybody stands around your grave. I'm going to place my reflections today within the context of Erikson's developmental theory. And I'm not going to go through the whole theory, but I am going to go through the last two stages of development. One is called late adulthood, and that's for those of us who are between the ages of 60 and 75. And the last stage is very old age, and that's 75 to death. Now, actually, when Erikson developed his concept, it was way back in the 40s and 50s. And so late adulthood was his final stage. Now it's very old age because we live longer. So we've had to add another piece onto that. And quite honestly, probably very old age could be broken down again into two parts because many people live, up to 100, 104, whatever. In those last two stages of development, you have to think about this. You cannot live the afternoon or evening of your life by the morning's rhythm. Don't we know it? I had a wonderful friend who's long dead now. She was in our retirement facility. And when I would go to visit her, she would be bemoaning, "Oh, sister, I don't have the energy I used to have. I feel like I'm not doing anything. I don't have the same energy." And I would say to her, "Lawrence, you're not supposed to. You're 80, whatever years of age she was at that time. You're not going to have the energy of a 40-year-old. It's not possible." Now, actually, at this point, I think she's up in heaven looking down at me and smiling and saying, "Do you know what it's like? Do you know what it's like?" And I do. I want to have the energy that I had when I was 40, but it's just not possible. It just isn't possible. So when Erikson divided his stages of development, he divided them into categories and tasks. So for every stage of development, he listed some tasks that were to be accomplished. Now, just as a disclaimer, no one accomplishes all the tasks in each part of development perfectly. It's not possible. We're human beings. But to the best of our ability and what happens in our environment as we, grow through all of those stages, hopefully we're able to accomplish much of each stage. Then he talks about, if you can picture columns, he talks about the psychosocial crisis. So for each stage, there's a psychosocial crisis. Crisis is really too hard a word because you think about, oh my God, we're in a crisis here. How are we going to get everything? It's really more of a psychosocial choice. So when I get to that part of my reflection today, I'll tell you what the choices are for very old age and late adulthood. And then his third column is his central process. And that's what helps you do the task, is who you are interiorly, how you have developed. That's what helps you to accomplish those tasks in the first column. And then his final column is what he calls the adaptive ego quality. What's the reward for getting through these tasks? When we embrace the call to be an elder, not older, an elder, a path of blessing opens up to us. So when we embrace that, a path of blessing opens up and we can see all sorts of things that we can be about as we age. So let's talk about Erikson's tasks for late adulthood. Maggie Smith has a wonderful line in the movie The Van. So if you haven't seen that movie, it's a great movie. And of course, you know what, Maggie Smith. So she's talking to someone much younger than herself, and she says, "Listen here, dearie, going downhill is an uphill battle." So that's true. Aging is an uphill battle, and it becomes more of a battle as we don't participate in it. We don't embrace being an elder. So the first task for late adulthood is accepting one's life, accepting where we are in life at this particular point in time. How do we do that? Well, we may do that by redefining ministry. I have this theory that as religious women in particular, we spend possibly the first 60 years of our religious life doing the corporal works of mercy, and we do them well. The church wouldn't be where it is without us. The country wouldn't be where it is without us. So we do those corporal works of mercy quite well through our hospitals, social service agencies, education facilities, you name it. We've done it, and we've done it very well. I believe that when we reach late adulthood stage, age 60 to 75, it's an opportunity for us to begin to work on the spiritual works of mercy. Now, that's not to say that we haven't been doing that all along, but I don't think that we concentrate there. There's enough to be done with the corporal works of mercy. So I think it's important that we concentrate and pray for the ability to really work on the spiritual works of mercy. Now, I've given this talk a million times, and whenever I say that, I see people in the audience, their faces kind of like get a little bit discombobulated, and I can see what's going through their head, the spiritual works of mercy. Oh my God, what are the spiritual works of mercy? You know, if I asked them for the corporal works of mercy, they'd rattle them off like that. So the spiritual works of mercy are to forgive all injuries. You know, looking back on our lives, where are the places where we didn't feel we were maybe treated as we should have been? So how do we come to a point of forgiveness there? To convert the sinner. And by the sinner, I don't mean the person that's out there murdering or creating havoc or whatever, but converting people, helping people to convert their own lives and accompanying them in that. To instruct the ignorant. You know, we bear a lot of wisdom, and so people may come to us or just in conversations with each other. What have you learned? What have you learned in your life? How are you an example to other people? So that instructing the ignorant doesn't necessarily mean just being in a classroom. There are a lot of opportunities for that. And I think of it in our communities, if you think of newer members, and I'm quite aware of the fact that we don't necessarily have a whole lot of them, but connecting the newer members with women who have lived the life is really important because we really grow in that wisdom of what we've heard from our elders. What have we learned from them? I'll tell you a funny story. When I was a novice, I was responsible for serving meals to a quite elderly sister. She was in her 90s at this point in time, 100% right off the boat from Ireland, and she had come here and worked for a very wealthy family and then eventually entered our community. So one day I was up, and we got to be pretty simpatico. So I was up there just visiting her, and she said to me, every night when you get ready to go to bed, say 3 Hail Marys for the gift of final perseverance. I do that every night. Well, I looked at her and I thought, oh my God, you're 90-some years old. Why are you worried about persevering? But it was a very helpful thing for me. I'm not going to tell you that I say 3 Hail Marys every night for the gift of perseverance, but that reliance on God that she had, that she knew she didn't have to do this all by herself, was a very important lesson for me. Comfort the sorrowful. In this day and age, we have so much of an opportunity for that, especially within our own communities. So how do we comfort one another, not only when people have lost, relatives and friends, but also lost members of the community? Right between Thanksgiving and Christmas, we lost 7 members of the local area of Sisters of Mercy. And the way I can describe it is like a pall just descended on the community. And so it was very, very difficult. So how do we comfort one another through that? How do we get ourselves through that? Counsel the doubtful. People who come to us and say, oh, I'm not doing enough, or I don't feel good about myself, or I should be doing this, that, or the other thing. How do we counsel people who are doubtful, or even doubtful about God's place in their lives? You don't have to be a spiritual director to do that. You can do it on a daily basis, as Winifred did for me. Say those 3 Hail Marys every day. bear wrongs patiently. I think as we age, people begin to treat us differently, whether we need to be treated differently or not. And sometimes it can really get on your very last nerve. So how do we bear those kinds of wrongs patiently when people are assuming we can't do things that we can do or won't do them or whatever? And then finally, pray for the living and the dead. Prayer is a part of our lives. It's well ingrained in all of us. So praying, maybe we have more time for prayer now than we did when we were out performing this corporal works of mercy. So I think that is the work of the aging process. And then another way of accepting one's life where we are now is having a life plan. What will your eulogy be? What eulogy virtues do you want to cultivate? And I'll get to that in a minute. But a weekly plan, and I think this is especially true for people who have retired. I know myself, if I have if I'm engaged in ministry every day, then I have a plan already, developed in my head. And as most of you do too, it might get a little bit thrown out of whack during the day, but you kind of know what you're going to do as the day goes on. But once you become retired, you have this amorphous amount of time and maybe no plan. So it's helpful to develop a plan for each day. What will you do for yourself this week? What will you do for God this week? Being very explicit about it. What will you do for others? In the plan, having a physical thing to do each day, get those 8,000 steps in. A spiritual thing to do, maybe spend a little more time in prayer. An emotional thing to do, maybe, watch your favorite show on TV or find a book or something that kind of raises your emotion, makes you feel better about yourself and everybody else. A psychological plan, what do I need to let go of and what do I need to embrace? So something each day, a plan like that. And then connecting with others. Technology is wonderful, but it inhibits real connection. So having a real connection with other people, maybe people with whom you live, or you write a note to somebody, or you make a phone call, things like that they certainly help to keep our minds alert and moving, if you will, and they help us to feel better about ourselves. So I think in under that first task of accepting your life, that making a plan is very important. The second thing is promoting intellectual vigor. The more you can keep your mind going, the less of it you're bound to lose. So what will your intellectual vigor be? And for those of you who are responsible for, healthcare facilities where people might be in assisted living or, in more skilled care, what are you doing? What are you putting in place that will promote intellectual vigor? I used to run a group here at St. John's, and I called the group Cinema Divina as opposed to Lectio Divina. And we would watch a movie a week, and then we would discuss what were the lessons I got from that movie. They weren't all, religious movies, but having been through them before, having seen what is the movie, then I would kind of pick out, well, what's possible that applies to my personal life or our communal life together? Book clubs, certainly, especially within larger retirement facilities, having a book club and encouraging people to read good books and then to come and to discuss them. And I'm not talking about William Shakespeare. I'm talking about, the nurses, or the popular novels at this time. Reading those and discussing them with one another, or a spiritual reading book. That have you seen this? Have you read that? All of those would be very important. Having the opportunity to attend lectures or talks, and if you find something on a Zoom that's very good, a TED Talk or something like that, letting everybody know that this is available, and then maybe encouraging people to talk about it among themselves. It's one thing to watch it. It's something else to share about it. Outings, gatherings, outings where people have the opportunity to go to a show or to go to a concert or to go to a movie. And then gatherings. How do we gather people together for celebrations? But, just to enjoy one another, maybe pizza and beer on a Friday night. How do we gather? That's important. And then the final thing there is asking the person, what do you want to do? Not what someone expects you to do, but what do you want to do? The sister that I was telling you about originally in my talk, where she was always telling me how she didn't have energy. When I would go to visit her, it oftentimes was on the afternoon that they had bingo at our retirement facility. And I would go in to visit her, and like steam would just be coming out of her ears. And I'd say, what's the matter? And she said, so-and-so, and so-and-so was the sister in charge at that time, wants me to go to bingo. And she's in here all day, every day, trying to tell me I should go to bingo. It would be good for me to go to bingo. And she said, I never played bingo in my life, and I don't want to play bingo now. Why should I go to bingo? Now, I know that the person who was in charge at the time wanted her to go to bingo so she would be among other people. But forcing somebody to do something that they really don't think they're going to get any pleasure out of it isn't the way to do that. It's finding out, okay, what does this person like to do, that we could find 2 or 3 other folks who might like to do the same thing. Redirecting, the third task for Erickson was redirecting energy to new roles. We're not going to have, that's why this is called From Role to Soul, we're not going to have the same roles that we had previously in our lives. So what are some things that we can do that we can redirect our energy to? It might be taking a turn to be the portress in a convent or the retirement facility. Active listening, like listening to one another and intentionally listening. That's a new role. Sometimes we listened to people because we had to help them solve their problem. This is just listening. Deep, active listening, just sitting there and being with is so important. Volunteering, if there's a possibility for volunteering in something in the immediate geographical community around a facility or within the facility, what can you volunteer to do? Not all day, every day, but maybe a couple hours, 2 or 3 days a week, tutoring students or whatever it might be. Getting the person involved in something so that there's a reason to get out of bed in the morning. 3 areas where I think adults have to reinvent their lives. The first is work and family roles. And this probably is more important for our married brothers and sisters, nieces and nephews. But, when people reach a certain age, they don't see themselves as important in the family as they once were. And we may see ourselves in the same way. So how do we reinvent that? How do we say, well, what is my place in the family now? Unfortunately, in the United States, we don't revere the elders the way they do in many other countries in the world. But how do you reinvent yourself with your family? And it might be that active listening, not solving the problem, just that active listening, or volunteering maybe to watch grandnieces and nephews if you're able to do that every so often. Even being with those younger people is such a boon to you. Physical activity is another area where we have to reinvent our lives. We were doing the corporal works of mercy. We were pretty active. We were moving around a good bit, even though we may not have realized that was one of the blessings of doing the corporal works of mercy. Now we're not able to be as physically active, but what can we do? Can we walk, 2 corridors in the mother house or in the retirement facility? Can we purposely walk from one place to the other rather than, getting on a bus or taking some other way? Is it within a good distance for us to be able to do that? Being very conscious of the physical activity that we're capable of doing. And then finally, committing to the lives of others. What's the commitment that regardless of our age, what is the commitment that we have to one another as we age? And when I say one another, I particularly mean each other in the community. What's our commitment to do the spiritual works of mercy with one another? Sometimes I think we're so good at seeing the need outside of ourselves that we can sometimes miss the need that's right beside us. So what can we do to, commit to the lives of the people around us and make a very deliberate commitment? I'm going to sit down and listen to Sister so-and-so today, or I'm going to ask her if I can go out and get her a cup of coffee, or whatever it might be. And in all of that, finding the balance between active goal pursuit — we're generally pretty goal-oriented people — between active goal pursuit and appropriate goal adjustment. In the morning, I'd wake up, put 2 feet on the floor and say, okay, now what am I going to be about today? What are my projects? So, in my head, I'm starting to, wash my face, brush my teeth, all of that. And I get my whole list in my head. And so by 10 o'clock, 2 things I had to let go of on that list. So I wasn't going to get to that. By 1 o'clock, 2 more things are off that list. So by 5 o'clock, it's a list of about 2 things. But you know what? At the end of the day, if I can say I accomplished those 2 things, that's a good day. So appropriate goal adjustment. We've got to be able to do that. And in order to do that, I like to say that we can follow something called the SOC model. And what the SOC stands for: S stands for selection, O stands for optimization, and C stands for compensation. So the selection is for us to identify the domains of activity that are of the greatest value to us. I think as women religious, we were kind of doing all things to all people, and some of them really didn't mean that much to us. They didn't have that much value for us personally. So as we approach, the very, first of all, late adulthood and then very old age, what are the things of the greatest value to us that we want to concentrate on? So identifying the domains of activity that are of the greatest value to me. Optimization stands for allocating and refining our resources in order to achieve higher levels of functioning in those domains that you selected. So what are some higher levels of functioning that you can develop in the domains of activity that have the greatest value to you? And then finally, compensation under conditions of reduced resources. And some of the reduced resources have to do with our physical and mental makeup as we elder. Under the conditions of reduced resources, identifying strategies to counteract the loss of those resources, but minimize the negative impact in the selected domains. Maybe one of your, I'll give you a good example out of my own life. For a while there, I babysat for a grandniece and a grandnephew once a week, all day once a week. So about this time last year, I fell, tripping over my Skechers, went flying through the air as I'm babysitting for them, to the tune of 17 stitches in my head. I happened to hit a metal table. Well, I don't know whether it was my wisdom in saying, I just don't think I can do this anymore, or whether it was my niece saying, I don't think I want her here doing this anymore. I'm not really sure what it was. But anyway, I had to minimize the negative impact in those selected domains. And so what I do is periodically stop into their house and, have a nice visit with the 2 kids and then move on. So because I can't do it, I know my own energy level won't allow me to. And then finally, the 4th task for late adulthood is developing a point of view about death. We don't talk about it. We don't talk about our fears, hopes, dreams, as much as we are involved in death and people's burials in this day and age. We don't really talk about it among ourselves. So how do we develop a point of view about death. And of course, I think the book Tuesdays with Mari is a perfect example of a good way to develop that point of view about death. Having a conversation about death, not just leaving it on our minds, but actually speaking about it. And, we can choose in death. We can't choose not to die, but we can choose among denial, defiance, or collaboration. So what do we want to do? Deny that it's ever going to happen to us, or fight against it in defiance, or collaborate with it? How are we going to do that? So if you remember, that second column in Erikson's developmental theory is the psychosocial crisis, or I like to say choice. So the choice is the choice between integrity and despair. And so to the degree that somebody is working through those tasks, they can develop good integrity about themselves, integrating life into themselves at that point in time. Whereas if they don't do that, then it's despairing. And, well, I never accomplished anything, and nobody cares what I do now, and nobody wants to see me, and, all of the negative things that can happen. So integrity is the ability to face the facts of one's life and face death without fear. So what were the facts of your life, and how did you actually work your way through them at the time you were going through them? It means to view the past in an existential light, the whole past, not just your mistakes. And I think sometimes we tend to concentrate on the mistakes rather than what was the whole life path, and whose lives did I influence along the way, and how happy was I as I was walking through that life. So it's an existential life. It's the whole of your life. To integrate your past history with your present circumstances. So even your past history, if you look at your family history and, what are some of the medical issues that seem to get passed down in a family, that's integrating that into your present situation, because now you might be faced with some of those same physical issues. Or you might have grown up in a rather dysfunctional family. Well, how have you integrated that into your life so you're not a dysfunctional person today? To face the decisions and experience of the past with acceptance. How do we do that? How do we, instead of bemoaning what was, how do we face those with acceptance? Okay, it was what it was. My parents did the best that they could, or this was the way it worked out. I wasn't, I didn't have the intelligence to do some of the things I wanted to do, but this is where I am today. If I spend all my time in the past, that's not going to be helpful, especially if the past were negative. So how am I going to integrate those and face it with acceptance? But how can I integrate it into my life? A very good book for describing this is a novel called Hannah, Hannah, Coulter, Coulter. And it's written by that great Southern writer, Wendell Berry. And it's the story of a woman from the time she is about 16 years of age up until the point of her dying experience. So it's a long, you go through the long life, but watching her integrate piece by piece along the way. I mean, she aged so beautifully. And then finally, making sense of one's life without belaboring those past mistakes. So making sense of your life without belaboring them. If that will all bring you to integrity. If you wind up with despair, that's like a death of dreams. All the things I wanted to do and I never got to do. So the death of dreams. So in order to experience integrity, we have to incorporate into our self-image a lifelong record of accomplishments. What did you accomplish along the way? As well as the conflicts, the failures, and the disappointments. No one gets out of this life, including Jesus Christ, with a list of accomplishments and no conflicts, failures, and disappointments. we're walking in the footsteps of Jesus, we have to realize that there's conflicts, failures, and disappointments are there. But how do we look at them in a way that we integrate them into our lives along with those accomplishments, conflicts, failures, and disappointments? Ageism. I believe it's alive and well. I believe it can be very alive and well even within our own communities, expecting less of somebody just because of the number after their name. So being careful not to do that with people, but actually to expect more, always just one little step ahead of where they might be at this moment. So for us, it's the perception that the community is letting go of us before they're ready to let go of life. And so figuring out, where is this person still experiencing life and how? We have to remember, at the age of 100, Grandma Moses was still painting, and she only learned how to paint when she was about 80. So there's a lot of room there. George Burns won the Oscar for the first time for The Sunshine Boys at the age of 94. George Bernard Shaw wrote far-fetched fables at the age of 93. Eamon de Valera became president of Ireland at the age of 91. Konrad Adenauer became the Chancellor of Germany at the age of 88. And Francis became Pope at the age of 80. So regardless of the number after our names, there's still a lot of life to be lived beyond that point in time, doing things that you enjoy doing and accomplishing things in that way. So how do we arrive at integrity rather than despair? Well, that's by that third column, which is the central process in late adulthood, and that's introspection. And hopefully, as we age, we allow ourselves more time, and it requires time, to engage in that introspection. And that leads to wisdom. That introspection leads to wisdom. And we introspect in silence as a rule. So silence is not silence, the absence of noise, but it's a limit of hearing or listening. So placing some limitation on the hearing and listening that we're doing. Just being alone doesn't necessarily mean we're being silent. So who are we in front of God in this silence and introspecting on, what has my life been like? David Brooks, he's one of my favorite people for writing. He writes for the New York Times. He has in one of his books, he has a wonderful chapter on when you reach these last two stages of life, writing your resume virtues versus your eulogy virtues. So your resume virtues are the professional, and they're oriented toward earthly success. So according to Brooks, we're working on resume virtues, from the time we get out of college until we're maybe 55, 60 years old. We're always into, that next step up the ladder. They require comparison with other people. In order to get that next step up the ladder, you're probably a step ahead of somebody else. So it's the kind of the dog-eat-dog way that we live, especially in the Western world, around our growth in society. Eulogy virtues, on the other hand, are ethical and spiritual, and they don't require any comparison with anybody else. So they're the ethical and spiritual virtues inside of ourselves. Your eulogy virtues are what you would want people to talk about at your funeral. What are the things you would like people to say at your funeral about you? As in, she was kind and deeply spiritual. Not, she made senior vice president at a young age and had a lot of frequent flyer miles. The point Brooks makes is that we live the most fulfilling life, especially after midlife, by pursuing the virtues that are most meaningful to us and have had the greatest impact on other people. So, the fact that you were senior vice president or that you had millions of frequent flyer miles isn't going to matter a hill of beans when everybody is at your funeral. And it's not what they're going to, walk away with. What they're going to walk away with is, what kind of a person was she for me? I remember this Sister Lawrence, who was the person I referred to twice before in here. When we were temporary professors, she taught us a class in, I'll say, classroom management. I forget really what it was. And I vividly remember her saying, children will not remember whether you were a good teacher or not a good teacher. What they will remember is, were you the kind teacher when I needed, an arm around my shoulder or a smile or something like that. And having become a teacher myself, I understand that. Now, I think by the time I got to college, I was a little bit more interested in, was it a good teacher or not a good teacher? But nevertheless, the person's kindness to me, or the way the person related to me, is what I remember the most. So I think that's part of our eulogy. Inability to do what once we did is inevitable as we age. And it sometimes occurs earlier than almost any of us wants to believe. At 85, you can still think it was too early for me not to be able to run a marathon or whatever. But if it happens at 50, 60, maybe because of some physical condition, it can be much earlier than we wanted it to believe it would be. But misery or lack of fulfillment is not the possibility of transcendence. And that's what we're working towards in this. It's because transcendence allows the shifting of attention to higher spiritual and life priorities. So part of developing these eulogy virtues are, what are your spiritual and life priorities at this point in your life? The purpose of retirement, as he says, is to let go of a professional life that answers the question, who am I? And to embrace the eulogy virtues, to move from activities focused on self to move to activities focused on others. So it's not about who am I? I'm the person, who made senior vice president and developed all these frequent flyer miles. That's not who I am. Who am I on the inside? And to embrace those eulogy virtues is important. And that's what you would be doing in this introspective time, in that central process of introspection. And then the relativeness of values and life goals, they shift as we age. Our values shift and our life goals shift. And so where are we now, and how much can we develop through where we are now, as opposed to, I must do this, I must do that, I must do the other thing. The recognition and management of uncertainty. Having read in Global Sisters report this morning about in California, sisters having to move other sisters out of convents and so on because of these fires, that is a management of uncertainty. Who could have thought that this could have happened, especially for this amount of time? And there's uncertainty all around us. There's uncertainty certainly in our communities. Where will we be in another 10, 15, 20 years? There's uncertainty in the church. So how do we manage those uncertainties? And then finally, the ability to awake to God's intimacy, even in the mundane moments of every day, as well as in the management of those uncertainties. And all of that, if that's what we're doing, that sense of integrity requires the ability to introspect about the gradual evolution of life's events and to appreciate their significance in the formation of an adult personality. How significant were your life events, and how did they get you to this point? So you can see where a lot of this requires silence. It's not easy work. It's hard work. You really have to be very deliberate about it. And then finally, if we get through all of those tasks, then the adaptive ego quality, the virtue that we get in the end, is wisdom. And we all know people who were very wise and brought a lot of their wisdom into our lives. And wisdom is a detached concern for life and a desire to learn and communicate essential lessons from experience in the face of impending death. What are some of the essential lessons from experience that you would need to incorporate into your life? And that wisdom has 5 features. One is factual knowledge. The second is procedural knowledge. How did you work your way through things? What was the procedures that you used? Lifespan conceptualization. So it's that existential looking at what your life has been like. And it's what, if you read that book, Counterculture, it's what she does. It's the relativism of values and life's goals. They change along the way. And then finally, it's that management of uncertainty. So let's go to very old age. Very old age, of course, begins diminishment, but it has more than a few benefits. We lose the ability to multitask, and that, I often say, that for me is the hardest thing about growing older. I can't keep nearly as many balls in the air as I used to, and I'm very happy at the end of the day if I have managed to keep one ball in the air. So it's, it's losing that ability to multitask, but to discover or rediscover at the same time the ability to do one thing at a time and do it well. I can remember when I was the principal of the school, all the balls that were in the air. And at the end of the day, they may have all landed where I wanted them to land, but very often not as well as I would like for them to have landed. So this time around, I can look at it and say, okay, I could only do one thing at a time, but I could do that well. I can concentrate on that and do it well. Our thinking has slowed down when we get to this very old age point. We're not as agile of mind as we one time were, but it's become deeper and richer because of the time we've spent by ourselves. So that's part of that, the grace of aging. And finally, we're finished with big projects, thank God, but more aware of the loveliness of simple things. A walk, a conversation. I know I like what the term one of our artist sisters uses is a term, I like artful living. So I enjoy, rearranging furniture in a room, doing a floral arrangement, prayer, putting prayer together very, deliberately and that kind of thing. When I was the principal of the school, I wasn't arranging flowers, I'll tell you that much. So it was, that I've been able to shift into things that I really enjoy, that give me that moment of contemplation that I so thirst for. So the task for very old age, the first one, this won't surprise you, is coping with the physical changes of aging. The rate of change increases after 60. So up until 60, change was, relatively small, but it increases a great deal after 60. And I personally say that 80 is the Rubicon. After 80, there is really no going back. Things just start to fall apart very quickly. So we need to have a commitment to good self-care. And we need to acknowledge we have a slower response rate, shorter prayer time. You don't have to pray for an hour every day. You can pray for 15 minutes, 4 times a day. Do it whatever is helpful to you to be able to pray. Later prayer time, not getting up at 5:30 in the morning because you have to be at school or at your ministry by 8 o'clock. Now, hopefully you have a little more latitude around that, or you have the control around it. That's the important thing. I lovingly live with a sister who likes to pray at 9 o'clock in the morning. It's perfect. I love it. I can get up earlier and do some things, but I don't have to feel that I have to be there at 9 o'clock and have everything in order. So that's a readjustment for sure of prayer time. And then sharing our spirituality through what we read or what we see on television or conversations that we've had. Continuing to develop that historical perspective and that integration of past, present, and future. your own history in your family, the country, the church, and religious life, and the opportunity to pass it on as a wisdom figure. Not just once, but often. Family gatherings. You hold the history of the family, many of you. It doesn't have to be labored. It can be a light social event. It doesn't have to be a great big deal. And as I said earlier, have newer members talking and mixing with the older members. They're like the grandparents to the newer members, and we have a different perspective on the history of the community. Old age is the accumulation of experiences. So we develop a perspective on the history, the effects of the history on each of our lives and each of our places in those chains of events. At the same time, we become more aware of life's uncertainties and lessons. And then traveling uncharted territories is the final piece of the tasks for very old age. And that means changes in all relationships, challenges to self-concept. I'm not as agile as I used to be. My mind isn't as sharp as it used to be. I don't have an active ministry anymore. All of those things. Successful agers stay engaged with life at whatever point they are. They avoid disease. They don't take on unnecessary chances that you might have been able to take when you were 40, 45 years old. They maintain high cognitive and physical functioning, like they keep working at that physical and cognitive functioning. And then they are sociable, active, and independent. And those things constitute successful living in very old age. And by independent, I don't necessarily mean living by yourself. I do have this thing. I really don't think that once we've reached 80, it's a good idea for us to live by ourselves, because something can happen in a heartbeat and nobody would know. So, but that independence is your independence of thinking, your independence of doing, independence about what you choose to do, those kinds of things. Really, we need to hang on to those things. Parker Palmer says in one of his books, we need to reframe aging as a passage of discovery and engagement, not decline and inaction. So what are you discovering as you age, and how do you engage around that discovery? And then the psychosocial crisis is immortality versus extinction. So if you've done the tasks as well as you could, you achieve a certain degree of immortality. I mean, think about in your own, think about certainly in your community histories, as well as in your family histories, people that have been long, long, long gone, and you still think about them as if they were still here. They're immortal in our memory. They're there for us. And so it's not so much that we want to be immortal in people's memories, but we can be if we have successfully aged. The quote I like for this is from Antonio Machado, and he has a wonderful quote where he says, I thought the fire had gone out until I stirred the ashes and burnt my fingers and rekindled the flame. So if we moved towards, I'm retired, I'm useless, if we kindle those flames, we might find that there's something more. The Book of Wisdom, there's a line, we should be as sparks emanating from fire. So we're not the big fire anymore, but we are sparks that can contribute a great deal to the people with whom we come in contact. So how do you perceive I will live on? Well, there's an African proverb that says, you will live as long as someone knows your name. So you live on as long as people remember your name. It's not necessarily what we have done, but it's who we have been for other people. That's the good ager, who we have been for other people. You and I, we add to the great cloud of witnesses. I love the whole concept of the communion of saints. And we add to that as we live, but then as we die, we also add to that. And then, of course, I'm sure sure that you have a necrology in your different communities. And I hope you pray for those sisters each day on the anniversary of their death, because that is remembering their name. So how do we reach immortality rather than extinction? Well, the process that we use to do that is social support. So what does the person need? How can we provide it for them? How can we encourage them to get it for themselves? What do they like? One of my failures, if you would say, in life was a sister who was in my group, entered with me, was in our retirement facility. She was dying of cancer. And there were 69 of us who entered together. So we didn't all get to be great friends, big friends with each other, because there were so many of us. And then there was another 69 in the novitiate with us. So that's 30 people. So I can't say that I knew this person well, but I mean, we had the same history. So I went over to see her when she was at Macaulay and she was dying. And I said to her, Helen, is there anything I can do for you? What would I need? Now, she was a great cook. And she said to me, I would love spaghetti and clams and a glass of white wine. So I said, consider it done. So I went out. Then we live in an area, our mother house is in an area where there's a lot of Italian restaurants. You'd be amazed at how hard it is to find one portion of spaghetti and clams. So I think I probably had to bring back a whole tray. But while I was out, I started to have these prinks in my conscience. And I thought, I don't know if I should bring wine back to her. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to cause her death, even though she's obviously dying. I don't want to cause her death, and blah, 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 blah. All this is going through my, Irish guilt mind. So I go back with the spaghetti and clams, but I do not bring back wine. So, of course, the first thing she said to me was, where's the wine? And I said, oh, Helen, I don't know. I wasn't really sure I should do that. She said, what difference does it make? I'm going to be dead by tomorrow. And she was. She died the next morning. So my not bringing her the wine didn't make any difference in when she died, but it did make a difference in what was left of her life. So that's like 30 years ago, I've always regretted that glass of wine not going there. So what does the person need at that particular point in time? She needed spaghetti and clams, of which she ate, when she was dying, of which she ate maybe a forkful. But that's what she wanted. And what do they want to do? How do they want to die? So I think we need to talk to each other about that. And then if we get through these tasks as much as we possibly can, then the adaptive ego quality or the virtue is confidence. We're confident moving on to meet Almighty God and to move to the next life, and really having left something in this life for all of the people who loved us and still having some influence on them. It's a continuation of the journey, but we can't be afraid to talk about it. And I do think we are. I don't think that's peculiar to women religious. I just think people are afraid to talk about death. Mary Oliver says, give responsibility for your life to no one. You take responsibility for the good and the not so good, and at the end, give it back. I hope you found this information helpful. You can tune into all of our Journey to Thrive podcasts on our website at sjvcenter.org. Click on resources or anywhere you get your podcasts. Thank you, and God bless you.